Hello and welcome back to Perspectives. On today's show, we're going to trace how Sikh identity itself, the very symbols that mark someone out as a Sikh, hardened into their modern form only after the British arrived in Punjab, and ask what that history means for how we think about authentic Sikhi today. We're also going to take a hard look at the Nihangs, Sikhi's warrior order, the protectors of the Akal Takht, and in recent years, protectors of protesting farmers too. And we're going to ask honestly whether every group carrying that name today still actually deserves the name. And also, we're going to trace Amritpal Singh's journey from an ordinary young man in a t-shirt and jeans to the imprisoned elected MP for Kador Sahib, as background ahead of course, the 15th of August, supposedly Independence Day of India, the Black Day of India, as Sikhs prefer to call it. And we're going to take a look at India's deepening surveillance state, built substantially on Israeli spyware technology, and ask what it actually tells us about a government that calls itself the world's largest democracy. And at the end of the show, we're going to finish off slightly differently today. This is actually in a direct response to a question that popped up in earlier this week. One of our regular viewers asked a very interesting, or a couple of very pertinent questions, and I have to say very uncomfortable questions. And those two questions were, is Khalistan a fascist idea? And can a Sikh state really promise equal treatment to everyone in it? Well, I took up that challenge, as I said I would at the time, and I'm going to try and answer that honestly. And of course, if you've got any comments about that, do let me know in the comments below. But we'll try and tackle that difficult subject at the end of the show, so do stay tuned for that. So anyway, let's get underway. And there's an awful lot to get to. There's very much a history sort of theme to today's show, because I think a lot of it is really important. And periodically I do cover sort of Sikh history, but it's also actually as part of my own educational journey. It's always very interesting to pursue a lot of these sort of avenues, so primarily for my own education, but also just to remind many of you what the history of Sikh is, how we got to today's Sikh, whatever today's Sikh actually is. So anyway, I want to start with a bit of history, because it is, of course, one that actually gets skipped a little bit too quickly, and it does actually matter for almost everything else that I'm going to cover sort of throughout today's show. Now, if you ask most people, Sikh or not, when the 5Ks, that's the uncut hair, the comb, the steel bracelet, the undergarment, the ceremonial sword, the kirpan, when they became the fixed universal markers of Sikh identity. And the honest answer is actually more recent and more contested than the popular story suggests. So, Guru Gobind Singh Ji established the Khalsa and its outward form in 1699, as we all know. And that origin, there's no dispute about that origin. But what's less widely understood is how much fluidity persisted for the century and a half after that, and how sharply that fluidity narrowed once the British arrived in Punjab. So before that annexation of the Sikh Empire in 1849, the boundary between Sikh and Hindu religious practices in Punjab was actually slightly blurred for large parts of the population. There were shared shrines, shared festivals, Sikhs who followed Guru Nanak's teaching without taking Khalsa initiation, even as today, but a spectrum of belief and practice. It was a spectrum as opposed to a single sort of binary hard line. There weren't just Sikhs and other religions. There was actually a lot of blurring of the lines. Indeed, actually, ironically, as is reflected today. And the British administration's own Punjab records, apparently, from immediately after annexation, noted with some concern that the Sikhs of Nanak were likely to persist as a distinct religious community, while the more martial Sikhs of Gobind Singh, the initiated Khalsa, were, in the colonial administration's own assessment at that time, at risk of fading as a distinct group entirely. So that was the British perception of Sikhs when they took over in 1849 and 1850. And that's also the backdrop against which the Singh Sabha movement and its more assertive wing that was known as the Tat Khalsa, they emerged in the late 19th century. And it was a reform movement that pushed deliberately and self-consciously for a much more standardised, exclusive Sikh identity. It talked about the uncut hair, the 5Ks as non-negotiable markers, a very clear line against idol worship and shared rituals with Hindu practices. It was a much more purist form of Sikhi, actually something that many Sikhs today still pursue, a much more pure form of Sikhi. And of course, they were aiming for a definition of Sikh that left much less room for the sort of the middle ground that actually had existed before during the Sikh Empire. And historians, and it's very hard to actually get the truth about this, because there are so many different researchers who come up with different conclusions. So apologies if some of what I say you disagree with, because it's very hard actually to get the concrete central truth, because actually, ironically, there might not be one central concrete truth. It's just a mélange, a mix of sort of different opinions and perceptions. But ultimately, historians do differ on how much of all this was purely an internal reform movement, the Tak Khalsa. How much of that was an internal reform movement responding to real erosion of Sikh values? But how much was also then shaped by the colonial environment that it was operating in? You know, the British classification, the martial race theory that specifically prized and recruited the turbaned, unshorn Khalsa Sikhs into the colonial army. But then how do they compare over other Punjabis? And a colonial bureaucracy did need very simple, clean, countable religious categories for its census. It needed to be able to easily identify, buckets of, well, he's a Sikh, he's a Tak Khalsa, he's this, that, the other. They needed that simplicity for things like, just for accounting, for measurement, for census, and of course for regiments in the British Army. Now, most serious historians, when they look at all this evidence, they sort of land somewhere in between all this sort of this information. The Tak Khalsa reformers were sincere and largely internally driven. But the colonial environment that they were existing in undeniably rewarded and reinforced exactly the sharper, more visible, more martial version of Sikh identity that the reform movement was independently pushing for. So the British actually appreciated and recognised that more purist, martial form of the Sikhs. And of course, then subsequently, they would encourage that. So ultimately, why does all this matter? When we talk about Khalistan and everything about the Khalistan movement today? Well, because it actually cuts against a story that gets told confidently on both sides and all sides of this debate. The idea that today's Sikh identity is simply an unbroken, unchanged continuation of 1699 and untouched by anything that came after. Of course it wasn't. Because like any society, any group of people, any religion in many ways, it was always shaped and sharpened by factors surrounding it, by simple human nature. And it was also, to some real extent, standardised during actually that same period that Indian nationalist history likes to paint as one of pure colonial victimhood for everyone involved. In other words, that whole period of the British Empire, there are so many different perceptions and truths, if you want to use that wrong word, about what actually happened. But ultimately, it does not make the 5Ks any less sacred, and it doesn't make modern Sikh identity any less real or any less worth defending. A tradition being shaped by history is not the same as a tradition being invented by it. But it should make us all just a little bit more careful, myself included, of course, about reaching for the word authentic as though it settles an argument. Because actually there is no such thing as authentic. It's all about perception, opinion, interpretation. Identity has a history, and the Sikhs are no exception. And understanding that history makes the identity more interesting. It doesn't make it less legitimate. It just makes it more rounded, more rich in history. So anyway, I just wanted to cover that sort of little bit of story, because it also feeds into really what I want to talk about next, which is the Nihangs. Because I have to say, I absolutely love the whole concept of Nihangs. When I first saw this picture, I think, gosh, it must be years ago when I first started the show. I remember saying to you guys that what a fabulous character this represents on every level. Apart from his outfit, it's just everything about him just exudes something. As a British, you imagine a British soldier on a battlefield facing a line of gentlemen like this, you would be terrified, absolutely terrified. That is absolutely magnificent. So anyway, so I want to talk about the Nihangs now. And the Nihang order traces its lineage back to the Akal Sena raised under Guru Hargobind Ji. And it was formalised in the time of Guru Gobind Singh Ji. It was irregular warrior ascetics, as they were called. And of course, they're very recognisable by these amazing sort of outfits. They're tall blue robes, they're tiered turbans, and of course the traditional weaponry, the kirpan, the sword, the full kirpan. And they were historically tasked with the defence of the faith, but specifically the guardianship of the Akal Takht itself. And all through that history, that amazing sort of historic evolution of Punjab and the Sikh Empire and post-Sikh Empire, the Mughal collapse, the Mizil period, which actually then sort of coalesced into the Sikh Empire, and of course then Ranjit Singh's own Khalsa army during the Sikh Empire. The Nihangs were that sharp edge of Sikh martial resistance. They really were the elite warrior class, which is actually, again, why I feel so sort of respectful and so admiring towards them. But the history itself, all that history is actually not in that much dispute. And it is, as I say, it's genuinely stirring. It's a great history to sort of hang on to. And but of course, I've covered it on several occasions. I've talked about Nihangs, and particularly in a very positive way, because, for example, recently we talked about the farmers' protests, the 2021 protests, and the subsequent 2023 protests, and then, of course, recent protests, the CJP protests. These guys do show up physically. They stand sentry through, the cold nights and the barricades of armed police, whatever. But they stand sentry at these protest sites because, well, actually, as more than one reporter has told at the time, Guru Gobind Singh Ji's teaching leaves no room for standing aside while ordinary people face state violence. Hence why, of course, they appeared at those CJP protests recently in that sort of guardianship role. However, and there is a however and a big fat but in all this, and it is an uncomfortable part, and it's something that I've seen across social media just every now and again, comments or posts that have been made that does actually sort of start to ask some uncomfortable questions. But it does. I want to address this really, just because I think some of you guys have actually talked about it as well. The name Nihang does carry, to some, a very different set of headlines, particularly when you look at the last few years of Punjab crime reporting. And individuals who identify, or at least claim the authority of being a Nihang, have been implicated in vigilante killings at Gurdwaras over alleged acts of sacrilege. They've been involved, allegedly, in violent confrontations with police. And in 2021, there was one specific incident at the Singhu farmers' protest site where a man was actually killed by a group claiming religious justification, Nihangs essentially. And it was an act that, of course, unsurprisingly, really damaged the movement's public image, just at a time when it really could least afford it. And then more recently, we've had incidents at Punjab Gurdwaras. There was a guy called, it was at the Gurdwara Chevin Patshahi in Phagwara. And someone identifying as a Nihang actually killed somebody apparently it was an act of Biadbi. But incidents like that have raised the same question. Who actually has the standing to act with the authority that the Nihang tradition carries? And who is just simply borrowing the robes, the weapons and the reputation to then justify something that tradition itself would, of course, never sanction in the first place? So, sadly, this, unfortunately, is ammunition for Hindutva, because this is exactly the kind of internal division that Hindutva, the forces of RSS, absolutely love. They seize on stuff like this. And so, again, this is why actually honesty is the best policy from our side. We've just got to address it and look and try and work out what actually is going on. In reality, according to all my research, there isn't a single clean answer. The Nihang tradition has never had a centralised command structure in the way that any normal modern institution would. It's always been organised into different jatas, and each having its own leadership, its own local practices, and historically its own degree of discipline. So there's no actual centralised coordinating control. And that decentralisation is part of what let Nihang survive actually through history, particularly underground, during periods when organised Sikh institutions were then being actively suppressed by the Indian state. But it's also exactly what makes it possible for these violent vigilantes with a sword and just putting on blue robes to then claim to be a Nihang and the same religious authority as a Jata that spent generations guarding the occult act with genuine discipline and restraint. So the tradition itself has not changed, but what has changed is how easy it is now for anyone just to essentially pretend to be a Nihang. They just put on the uniform, put on the beautiful blue purple robes, and away they go. So these are genuine guys. I think this is at the CJP protest, these guys. So ultimately, I mean, I don't have the answers. Certainly not something that I can sort of solve in our short time on the show. But a question that the Panth itself hasn't resolved either. But honestly, the position is, if you judge the entire Nihang tradition by its worst recent actors, and that is a key word, actors, people who dress up as Nihangs, you cannot judge the entire Nihang tradition by that. It's as unfair as judging it purely by its most romantic historical image. They're not that. They are... Look, I mean, both things are true at once. They are genuine guardians of the faith who do show up when ordinary Sikhs need protecting. And a tradition that is vulnerable because precisely of that decentralised structure. And it is vulnerable then to being borrowed by people with far less discipline and far worse intentions. So there is no clear and clean answer to all this. But it does mean it's an issue that does need addressing. It is an issue that needs looking at to try and work out how do we prevent the good name and the good reputation of the Nihang tradition being trashed and damaged by fakes. And it's interesting, it parallels the discussion about Sikhs and fake Sikhs that we talk about on a regular basis. So anyway, let me know your thoughts on that one. As I say, it's one of the key foundations of Sikh identity. And it's such a powerful image when you see these guys. They do represent such a wonderful image that represents the Sikh faith. And to say any damage caused to that is unforgivable. Anyway, let's move on. I want to talk just briefly about Amritpal Singh Ji. He, of course, sadly resides in Dibrugarh jail over in Assam. But there was Baz News actually just posted up. They just posted up an old interview just the other day actually, where they gave a bit of background of Amritpal, and I do talk about Amritpal quite regularly. Of course, what's the word I'm looking for? I was going to say ownership. That's not the right word. He presides over, and he is the founder of Warriors Punjab Day, or a co-founder of Warriors Punjab Day. He actually potentially holds the political key to the future of Punjab, followed on by Khalistan. This is the guy that potentially has the power through local efforts to deliver Khalistan. So this is why I just want to do a quick resume, let's say, of who Amritpal Singh is. For you guys who, obviously most of us have all heard of him, but many of you might not know his sort of story. So I'm just going to do as a quick piece, a story about who Amritpal Singh is, and just give you a bit of background on this figure who really represents so much. He, as I said, he is the co-founder and head of Warriors Punjab Day, and of course since last year he is the elected member of Parliament for Kador Sahib. But of course he still practices as an MP inside a jail cell in Dibrugarh jail. But it's worth remembering all that because it's genuinely easy to forget once someone does become such a consequential figure that it's important to then look at how an account of, or how this guy came from just being an ordinary young man to become such a powerful figure and such an important figure. He is, when he was a young man, before any of this all sort of happened, he was apparently clean shaven. He wore T-shirts and jeans. He had no particular public profile. And then ultimately became the man that we know now. And he ultimately was appointed to lead Warriors Punjab Day itself following the sudden and still controversial death of Deep Sidhu, again, who we talk about regularly. But Deep Sidhu, of course, was the organisation's founder. So Amritpal did take over Deep Sidhu's role. Now, in this extended interview with Baz, shortly after taking on the role, so this is, what date was this? This is 2023, January 2023. So it's 3.5 years old, but this was just after he'd taken control, or he became the leader of Warriors Punjab Day. He talked about a vision, and his vision that was at the time genuinely broader than the single issue image that the Indian press would later paint of him, basically to reduce Punjab's structural reliance on the Indian state for things like education, legal aid, rebuilding village-level self-governance along more traditional lines, against more traditional Sikh lines, and doing what he described as the patient, unglamorous work of connecting with the communities, both physically and digitally, rather than just simply being a politician and making noise. And as he said, his actual words were, people are not just built to work 9 to 5 and pursue materialism. There is something greater that we have to fulfill. So you can start to see his whole sort of Sikh faith starts to really come out. He's not just not just a politician. He never was a politician, but he sort of fell into politics almost just through the evolution of events. But of course, what followed that interview is obviously, pretty well known now. It hit almost global headlines. He had a rapid rise through the Khalsa Vahir tour. That was the escalating friction with Punjab and central authorities. And then, of course, that massive manhunt 3 years ago that then led to his arrest, I think it was in April 2023, under the National Security Act, this really questionable piece of legislation. And then, of course, his subsequent continued detention in Dibrugarh jail in Assam. And note, he was put in jail in Assam, thousands of miles away from Punjab, deliberately, essentially to dislocate him from his family, but most importantly from his supporters, from his political base. It was a deliberate move by India. But of course, all those acts, and particularly his continued detention, which again is highly questionable from any legal norm, certainly from a democratic perspective. It is outrageous. It certainly is arbitrary detention. But his continued detention, even as his political standing has grown, it's actually not worked the way that India had rather hoped. Because his election to Parliament from Khadur Sahib constituency, while still in prison, and that was a result that absolutely stunned much of the Indian political establishment, it turned him from a regional panthic figure into something much, much bigger. And it was proof to his supporters that the state's attempt to silence him through detention had achieved basically the opposite of what it had intended. His profile has never been higher, and this is the wonderful thing. Now, obviously, as we talk about his background, it doesn't resolve every argument about Amritpal Singh's politics or his tactics or his long-term vision. But we've covered, and we'll obviously continue to cover, the specifics of what he stands for as hopefully they sort of do develop and grow. But what is worth considering, particularly today, and particularly ahead of the 15th of August, of course, India's Independence Day, it's simply the arc of who this guy is. It's his story, the arc from his past to today. It is the story of this unremarkable young man, handed leadership of a grieving organisation after Deep Sidhu's death, articulating a vision of self-reliance and community building that then got rapidly overtaken in the mainstream telling, of course, of it, by a much narrower and more alarming sort of picture that they painted. And a state response that turned a relatively obscure regional leader into a sitting MP and a genuinely national symbol. In other words, he's come from pretty much nowhere through that story to become one of the most high-profile figures in India today, despite the fact that he's in jail. So it doesn't matter what you think of Amritpal Singh's politics. That story in itself should give India's security establishment pause for thought. Really. They've got to think about whether arbitrary detention without any prospect of poor Amritpal getting out is actually achieving the absolute opposite. And that's even before I start talking about Jagtal Singh Johal, which is another story. But there are others, of course, in prison with Amritpal. And all it's doing is highlighting to the world at large the truth about India. And it's a very uncomfortable truth. But as I say, his story is... it's a fascinating story, and it stands testament to the potential future of northwest India. And of course, the establishment of Khalistan, because of course he is powerfully pro-Khalistan. He was elected with a majority of over 200,000, unprecedented majority in Khadur Sahib constituency, which in itself proves to any doubters that Punjab is pro-Khalistan. Given any electoral opportunity, Amritpal Singh has provided the proof through his election that the Khalistan movement is not a fringe movement. It is a mainstream movement, and it's not just mainstream, it is clearly the majority feeling within Punjab. Anyway, I'm just going to move on now. Again, it's another Indian story, but this is a story that we have touched on in the past. And I saw this, and it's deeply, deeply concerning. This was posted up by Sikh News Express, I think it was yesterday or overnight. They talked about WhatsApp and certain WhatsApp accounts in India. If you're in India and your WhatsApp account suddenly sort of vanished or stopped working, you get a notice, and a fairly worrying notice, account in review. Date requested, your account activity and device info is being checked to make sure it follows our terms of service. We will notify you within 24 hours. And then the review notice also included links to information on how to use WhatsApp responsibly, etc., etc. In other words, the Indian state WhatsApp itself has bowed to pressure from the Indian state. Clearly, there is something sinister going on. Why on earth would certain accounts in India suddenly be essentially closed down for review? We know why. I don't even need to tell you why, because this is India in action. And I do want to sort of talk about this now, just briefly, in the whole context of India's sort of surveillance society. And I want to talk about the machinery of stuff like this. Sorry, there you go. The core facts of all these sorts of methods that the Indian state uses, they're not news to you guys. I do talk about them regularly, but they do bear repeating because the pattern keeps extending rather than reducing, and this is the fear. Now, for example, Pegasus. Pegasus is that military-grade spyware developed by Israel, a company called NSA Group. And it first came to global attention about 5 years ago, 2021, when leaked records showed it had been used against more than 1,000 phone numbers in India alone, including, of course, unsurprisingly, journalists, opposition politicians, and civil society figures. In other words, anybody who might disagree with the Modi regime. Now, India's Supreme Court agreed back then that the allegations were serious enough to warrant a technical committee investigation. And that committee reported back a few years ago, and it found on who exactly authorised the surveillance was never made public. And the part worth really considering, more than 2 years after that, as one commentator bluntly put it, the Supreme Court's continued silence on Pegasus has functioned as a de facto legitimisation of spying on the government's critics, whether or not that was the court's original intention. In other words, people are now saying the fact that the court really has not acted upon it, they're actually essentially sending a message that it's okay. It is okay for the Indian state to surveil, spy on its citizens and do acts like this. And this is the worry. And the sad thing is it hasn't stopped. And in 2023, Amnesty International's Security Lab and a whole bunch of independent forensic investigators did confirm fresh Pegasus infections on the phones of people like Siddharth Varadarajan, he's the founding editor of The Wire, and Anand Mangnali of the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. They were both journalists whose work has specifically involved holding the Indian government to account, scrutinising the Indian government and its allies. So in other words, they were essentially enemies of the Indian government, and they were being spied upon. And then more recent research this year has actually broadened this picture a lot further, and they document how commercial spyware tools, generally, Pegasus and actually newer generations of this, things like Paragon's Graphite, another piece of spyware, they've become normalised instruments for the Indian state. Not of counter-terrorism, which is actually how Israel's export licensing officially justifies selling Pegasus for counter-terrorism purposes, but it's now being used for routine surveillance against journalists, lawyers, political opponents, and obviously around the world in states that still call themselves supposedly democracies. And of course India sits well and truly inside that pattern. A so-called democracy, yet it uses spyware to spy on its political dissenters. That's not democratic. So I want to put that fact alongside everything else that we talk about regularly. Transnational oppression, obviously, one of them. And I also want to talk about consulates in a moment as well, because consulates, as we know, allegedly have been used, that infrastructure of consulates around the world have been used to track and surveil Sikh activists abroad. I've talked about the duty to warn notices that have been issued here in the UK, in Canada, Maninder Singh just recently, in Canada, amongst many. And this transnational oppression, which is directly linked to this sort of surveillance activity. If you put all that together, then a state that is prepared to use military-grade spyware against its own domestic journalists, these are people holding Indian passports, operating inside India's borders, and in theory protected by their own constitution. If they're using methodologies like the spyware, Pegasus, and the subsequent generations, that is not a state that needs much persuading to extend the same tools and the same instinct outwards to us out here in the diaspora. Because, the price is a lot less. You can get away with it a lot more easily if you start spying overseas on the diaspora. And that, again, is why this story is so relevant. Because what happens in India is very quickly extended out to the diaspora. So all these latest developments in India, like the WhatsApp sort of story I just talked about, it's not going to be long before that suppression, that persecution and that surveillance then extends to you guys, to people like myself. And the surveillance of Sikh activists overseas, here in Europe and in North America, down under, wherever, it is, sadly, we report on it very regularly, but it is not a separate story from everything else linked to it, like transnational oppression. Ultimately, it is the same instinct operating at longer range. It is that same story. It's part of that same whole package designed to target political dissenters, and particularly Sikhs and Khalistanis. So ultimately, as I've said it before, and I no doubt will say it 100, well, touch wood, I'd say it 100 more times, any government that needs to surveil its journalists to survive scrutiny is not, whatever the size of the electorate, functioning as the world's largest democracy. All it's doing, it is managing dissent rather than answering it or debating it like we do here in the UK or America or wherever. It's silencing. So, there you go. Now, I want to, the final part of today's show is going to be slightly different because it does make me chuckle, actually. Here we go. The Sikh Jedi. Hello, SJ. One of our regulars. Hi, Sikh Jedi. I hope you're watching this one. Now, in, I think, was it Monday's show, there was quite a heated debate going on in the live comments. And I've got a few comments to sort of talk about, just a very small number of comments at the end of today's show to sort of talk about. But I wanted specifically, for this sort of final half of the show, to address two comments and questions that came from the Sikh Jedi. Because these are really important. And they're chuckling, because this meme, for those of you who recognise this meme, it's a very clever meme, actually. It is a meme. It was set up as the guy is a comedy actor. He's a very clever guy, actually, one of my favourites. But this meme is essentially a Nazi just doing a little bit of self-introspection and saying, hang on, are we the baddies? Because, of course, the Nazis thought we're the goodies, we're the good guys. As, of course, everybody does. We're the good guys. Yeah, whichever side of a war on, of course, you're a good guy and God's on your side, which is slightly paradoxical when most wars, Crusades is a prime example, both sides thought God was on their side. Well, unless there's a whole raft of gods, it's actually not possible. So, but it does always create that question. Are we the good guys? And Sikh Jedi actually touches on this with his, I would say, very philosophical questions. And it is worth, and I did actually say in the show, I think it was Monday or Tuesday, I did actually say, I very briefly touched on this. And I said, no, of course it's not. But I thought, you know what? This deserves a whole segment to actually ask the uncomfortable question. Is Khalistan a fascist ideology? Are we the bad guys? That's the real question. And, I mean, Sikh Jedi did sort of ask this question several times, and to his credit, he's he's kept asking the question, even actually was as a sort of the debate got quite heated, I think, to put it mildly in the comments. I say, do keep it calm, guys. It's always nice to see you sort of debating, but just keep it nice and friendly. But ultimately, yes, he did ask these questions. I say he, it could be a she for one, but I think I've assumed that you're a he. But anyway, let me know otherwise. He did ask these questions. Is, at its core, Khalistan a fascist ideology? And then this really, really important question, and this actually does require some proper discussion. How can a state be Sikh and simultaneously promise equal treatment to everyone in it? Doesn't that second thing contradict the first? And I actually think both these questions are perfectly fair questions to ask. And I think to try and dodge them or avoid them would be a complete failure. And a failure of exactly the kind of stuff that, I stand for. I stand for the truth I stand for. Okay, some uncomfortable questions. Let's ask ourselves some uncomfortable questions in pursuit of the truth. So as I say, that's why I actually want to sort of talk about this and look at a bit of history, just to try and come up with a conclusion to answer, hopefully in more detail, Sikh Jedi, about your questions. So I want to start with the fascism question. Because, of course, that term, fascist. I mean, if I had $1 for every time I read the word fascist on social media, I wouldn't need to be sitting here. Well, I do need to be sitting here from a moral obligation. But in terms of making a living, I wouldn't need to be making a living. I'd be sitting on a yacht somewhere in the Caribbean. Because ultimately, it has to be one of the most misused and abused words on social media. It is one of the terms that just gets thrown around so loosely on all sides of every single debate. You're a fascist. Even the left call the right fascist and the right call the left fascist. So what is it all about? Well, fascism, properly defined, isn't just nationalism that I don't agree with. It's a fairly specific historical phenomenon. It is ultra-nationalism, but fused with authoritarian one-party control. It includes many aspects to it, but it also includes the systematic suppression of any dissent and opposition. It also usually includes some sort of mythology about a national rebirth. And quite often, it scapegoats some sort of internal enemy, blamed for national humiliation. The prime example is, of course, the Nazis in Germany in the 1930s. They scapegoated the Jews and the Gypsies, etc. So those are the main pillars, let's call them, of what fascism is. So that is what a fascist state is. It includes all those sorts of things. So on that definition, of course, a stateless minority organising for self-determination, like Khalistan, does not automatically then qualify as a fascist state just because it's built around a shared religious and ethnic identity. Because if it did, if you're right, if Khalistan was fascist, then actually you can put the same label on Zionism, the Kurds, Kurdish determination, Irish republicanism, Tibetan independence, Quebec. Actually, ironically, even the Scots here in the UK, because under that same sort of accusation, all those then technically would be fascist too. Of course they're not. Nobody would seriously even begin to argue that. So what actually matters is, going back to my definition, it's the second half of that definition. It's not just about nationalism. It's ultra-nationalism, but combined with a whole raft of other things. So what does the movement propose to do with power? What does the Khalistan movement actually intend to do once it is established? Once it has power, what's it going to do with it and to whom? And that's the important bit. And of course, that obviously is what the Sikh Jedi is alluding to, Hindutva. It's worth being very precise. We've got to be very precise about the terminology here. Because the comparison is to Hindutva. We obviously very often describe Hindutva as fascist. And the two, when you look at Hindutva and the Khalistan movement, they are not structurally symmetrical on any level, despite any rhetorical similarities. We might all use the same sort of nationalist language in terms of trying to establish the Hindu Rashtra or Khalistan. but that is the only area where those similarities lie between the two. Hindutva is obviously, it's a numerical majority. Roughly 80%, just over 80% of India's population are Hindus, organising through the machinery of an existing powerful state, of the Indian state, to then impose cultural and religious dominance over all the other minorities who just happen to live inside that state and cannot really leave. So that is Hindutva. It's got the backing, essentially, the de facto backing of 80% of India's population. The Khalistan movement, whatever else is true about it, is the position of a minority inside that same state, arguing it already experiences majoritarian domination and wants to get out. It wants to exit. So wanting to leave a house that you say is being burnt down around you, it's not the same thing. It's a very different thing, structurally speaking, because owning the house and deciding to burn out the tenants is essentially what India's doing. And Khalistanis are in the house. They are the victims within a burning house that somebody else has set alight. They want to get out. That's the difference. That's sort of the metaphorical difference between Hindutva and the Khalistan movement. Now, it doesn't make every argument that the Khalistan movement makes being absolutely correct. But ultimately, the problem with the Khalistan movement is it has actually many forms. It has many organisations that represent it, many groups of people who represent it in all slightly different ways. And it, for example, it doesn't mean every Khalistani, for example, is a Democrat at heart. They might have differing views. They might be much more socialist in their political minds. But ultimately, it does not mean that fascist label can be attached to the whole movement. Because throwing that fascist label immediately undermines any sort of credible debate. As I've said, under the definition, Khalistan cannot be labelled as a fascist state because it does not tick, or if any, only ticks probably one of those boxes, which of course is the ultra-nationalism. It is the nationalist desire, that nationalist motivation. We want our own country. But ultimately, though, and I think the more important one is, it's quite easy to dismiss the fascist argument. So I don't want to spend too much time on that because I think even Sikh Jedi, I don't think genuinely, really think, if you look at the definition of fascism, I don't honestly think you would genuinely think Khalistanis are fascist. But your second question is actually a much harder question to answer. And I think this is a really important question. How can a state be constitutionally Sikh but simultaneously promise everyone inside it equal treatment? Now, I'm not going to answer that with, let's say, a comparison to Pakistan or Israel or the Vatican and just leave it there and say, well, they do it, because that's just an easy way out of this. It's not really an answer. And it's a very unsatisfactory answer. And even I would feel sort of, I don't feel I would answer the question just saying, well, look at the Vatican, look at Israel, because actually there is a bigger story to this. If you dig deeper, we can answer this question in a much more substantial way, in a much more genuine way. Okay, so here we go. So the most detailed attempt at a Khalistan constitution, because of course we've got to look at, okay, how would we run Khalistan? This is a question that many people do ask. So the most detailed attempt that was actually attempted to put some sort of Khalistan constitution together, and it is in the public record, and I did actually do a piece on this, gosh, it must be a year and a half ago, some time ago. It is on public record, and it was drafted by a Panthic committee that was convened under the Occult Act, so it does carry weight, and it happened in the aftermath of that Sabha Khalsa in 1986. Again, I've done a lot of discussions about that Sabha. That really important. That was the official foundation of the Khalistan movement. That Sabha Khalsa that was held in 1986 at the Golden Temple. And just shortly after that, a Panthic committee then convened and drafted this draft constitution of Khalistan. And it is very explicit. It is totally unambiguous. And particularly when it comes to equality. On that equality point, it is absolutely specific. It says, full civil liberties, and I'm quoting now from this one, full civil liberties and fundamental rights will be guaranteed to all citizens in equality regardless of race, colour, religion, creed or language. and citizenship itself is defined the same way. Anyone resident or domiciled or born in Khalistan, regardless of race, colour, religion, creed or language, would be a full citizen entitled to the state's protection. So if you read only that clause, and then obviously look at Sikh Jedi's paradox in his question, it does result. Legal equality for everyone, full stop. There is no argument. The Constitution, as drawn up in 1986, says everyone, regardless, will be treated as equals. But it actually isn't as simple as that. Because if you keep reading, it does actually get a little bit more complicated. And it touches on something actually that I've talked about. And this is important because I'm going to sort of give myself a slap on the wrist about this, because actually there's something in this Constitution which you should know about. And it gets more complicated. And not less, sadly. It gets more complicated. Because it's very easy that we can sort of flatter the whole Khalistan cause with that wonderful "we are all equal" sort of clause that sort of stands out there, and then just ignore the rest. But unfortunately, that same draft then reserves 2/3 of the seats in the National Council, 2/3 of the cabinet, specifically for members of the Khalsa Panth, the Amritpal Sikhs. Of course, that is a narrower category than ethnically or culturally Sikh, let alone any citizen. In other words, only Amritdaris can actually hold 2/3 of the cabinet and 2/3 of the National Council seats. So immediately, actually, it's not open to all. And the judiciary, under this draft, is explicitly not independent. Its decisions are required to, quote, reflect the Khalsa's spiritual philosophy, with final recourse sitting with the Akal Takht itself. That is a religious authority. It is not a secular court. And the military, at all times, is required to have a Khalsa Panth majority, serving under a religious oath of allegiance. And most pointedly, for Sikh Jedi's question, non-Sikh religious organisations are explicitly permitted to exist and carry out their own spiritual activities, but are explicitly barred from any participation in the instruments of government, nor in a political capacity. So, here's the honest answer, and I'm not going to, hide it. It is, on this specific draft, civil and legal equality for every citizen is genuinely promised, and it does appear to be meant sincerely. But equal political power is not. So a non-Sikh in this Khalistan would actually have the same rights as any Sikh to their person, their property, their safety, their faith, their freedom of everything, but not the same access to the levers of power, those levers that actually run the state, and not to a judiciary answerable to anything other than a Sikh religious authority, the Akal Takht. So that's genuine. That is in this draft post-1986 from the Akal Takht. And it is actually, interestingly, structurally closer to Israel's Jewish and Democratic Balancing Act than to any, let's say, fully secular republic. And arguably it's sharper, given the explicit bar on non-Sikh political participation. So, okay, just before we jump to, a conclusion on this, there are a few things that still really that we can talk about this. This is just one draft. It was produced by one Panthic committee 4 decades ago. It's historic. It is not a ratified constitution, and it's not necessarily binding on actually how any future Khalistan government would actually be built. For example, the Sikhs for Justice referendum campaign, for what it's worth, does tend to speak in much more vaguer terms about democracy and the government model, and doesn't reproduce that sort of level of detail, publicly at least. And we genuinely don't know whether that's because their thinking has moved on from this, or because specifics, invite exactly this kind of sort of uncomfortable questions. But I wanted to push further on this, because there is a distinction that is worth drawing very carefully. And it's one that I put my hand on the heart and say, I'm guilty of this. There is a real difference between a theocracy and a state that happens to have a religious character at its head. Now, Iran is a theocracy in the absolute strictest sense. An unelected supreme leader with final authority over everything, the military, the judiciary, foreign policy, a guardian council of clerics that vets every candidate for office, and that's before voters ever even see a ballot. And then, of course, a constitution that subordinates elected government to clerical rule as a matter of design, not just symbolism. So, in other words, Iran is the prime example of a theocracy. Every level is controlled tightly by, well, I'd say the extremists, the real purists of that religion. That is Iran. That is a true theocracy. So, this draft, this Khalistan constitution from back in 1986, it does have some theocratic elements in it. The judiciary that's answerable to the Occult Act, not the law, a cabinet 2/3 reserved for Amritdaris, a military bound by religious oath. So if that draft was adopted, as it's written there, then theocracy actually wouldn't be an unfair word for it. You could actually argue that then Khalistan would be at least a part of, or at least some shade of a theocracy. So, is that really what Khalsa Raj has to mean? Is this really what is the vision of the Khalistan movement? Is this what the Khalsa Raj should actually represent? Or is there a genuinely different model available? Seeking character but meritocratic rather than clerical. In other words, people get promoted based on how good they are for the job, how suitable or qualified or experienced they are for the role, not just because they happen to be a Sikh. Well, here, the Sikh movement actually has a much better historical example to point to, rather than that 1986 constitution draft. Of course, it's Maharaja Ranjit Singh's Sikh Empire, the one actual sovereign Sikh state in history. And it ran almost exactly this way. His Prime Minister, Dhyan Singh, was a Hindu Dogra. His Foreign Minister and one of his most trusted advisors, Fakir Azizuddin, was a Muslim. His Finance Minister, Dewan Dina Nath, was a Hindu Brahmin. Muslim generals commanded artillery units in the Sikh army. Now, none of that was tokenism, and contemporary accounts of the researchers, historians, are consistently agreed that Ranjit Singh promoted on competence and loyalty, not on religion or creed or whatever. And non-Sikhs held a genuinely disproportionate share of the empire's most senior positions. So if you're looking for a real-world precedent for a Sikh political structure that runs on a meritocracy rather than theocracy or religious gatekeeping, that is it. This is it. And it's a much more persuasive answer to Sikh Jedi's question than anything in that Khalistan constitution draft. So, as I often say on the show, the precedent has been set. Khalistan should be, and I believe will be, operated on the same principles as the very original Sikh Empire. And that is what was successful then, and that is what will make it successful in the future. So, but when we talk about Sikh Empire, multi-faith Ranjit Singh's ministry was, as I say, it was a multi-faith meritocracy. Ultimately, though, and we have to admit, the throne itself obviously never left Sikh hands. It was a hereditary Sikh monarchy, Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji, and followed on by, his son, etc., etc. In other words, it was hereditary. So when we talk about Khalistan, the question of a non-Sikh actually holding the top position, well, back in those days, it never really arose because the position wasn't elected in any sense that we'd recognise today. So the empire actually just proved the case for meritocratic government beneath the head of state, emphatically, but it doesn't on its own settle what actually happens at the very top. And that really is down to discussion, because actually there is no answer as yet. Who will be the leader? But certainly the model of governance, the government model, the political model to govern Khalistan, there is no reason it cannot follow the same model, that Panj Pyari model of the Sikh Empire, of Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji's empire. And it comes back to something, which I say I do hold my hand up to this. It was a claim I made on the show, actually, a bit flippantly. I think it might, in fact, it may well have been in answer to Sikh Jedi, one of Sikh Jedi's questions on an earlier show. And I think you asked in the live comments, does that mean a Hindu could lead Khalistan? And I flippantly said, yeah, of course he could. Well, is that right? Well, the honest answer is, I don't know, actually, in reality. Now I've researched everything. It is genuinely unresolved. And anyone who can actually tell you with total confidence either way is, well, actually overstating what actually exists in writing. There is no ratified Khalistan constitution. There's that draft. But there's, as I say, lots and lots of other groups and organisations that think differently. And the only detailed draft in the public record is that 1986 Panthic Committee document. And in that document, it would effectively make it impossible for a Hindu then to lead Khalistan, reserving that Governor-General's election to a cabinet that is 2/3 Khalsa Panth by design and then confirmed by the Occult Act. So if that draft is your reference point, then no, actually in reality, a Hindu cannot lead Khalistan. But, and there is a big but here, that draft is 40 years old, or nearly 40 years old. It is actually effectively now, it's 40 years old. And it was produced in a very specific moment in time by a specific religious body. And it obviously isn't what a modern iteration of the Khalistan movement would be. Built, obviously, more on Ranjit Singh's meritocratic model than that sort of Panthic committee back in 1986. So that's the difference. In other words, that constitutional document from 1986 was written at a very specific time in politics and obviously what had been suffered by the Sikh people in Punjab at that specific time. So understandably, there was this powerful feeling in the Sikh community that, of course, we must remove anything that's non-Sikhi because we've been betrayed so many times now and we are literally being murdered and massacred in large numbers. So, of course, we've got to withdraw into a core nucleus of pure Sikhs and reject anybody who isn't, or at least give them a token amount of sort of existence and power, but no more. So, of course, that constitution reflects that moment in time, the political feeling in time. But now, in 2026, we're in a very different climate, a very different political climate, both domestically in Punjab and, of course, globally. So there is a live template for exactly this kind of split available closer to home, interestingly, and one that doesn't require reaching for any sort of theories at all. The United Kingdom. Weirdly, the UK is formally a state with an established church. The monarch is legally required to be a Protestant and is supreme governor of the Church of England. Full stop. No ambiguity. The UK is officially, legally, constitutionally Church of England. There is no, technically, constitutionally speaking, no room for a Sikh or a Hindu or a Muslim monarch under the current settlement. And yet, the country's actual head of government, the office that runs the executive, has been held by a Hindu Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, with absolutely no constitutional obstacles whatsoever. And nobody calls the UK a theocracy for maintaining a Protestant monarchy alongside a religiously open premiership. The ceremonial, symbolic headship, the actual executive power have just been separated. And it works. So a modern iteration of Khalistan that kept, for example, a ceremonial role for the Occult Act, recognising the Panth as the spiritual and cultural anchor of the state, much like the Church of England anchors British ceremonial life, the actual executive, the legislature and the judiciary, to any citizen can be granted on merit. Anybody. And that would not be a betrayal of the Khalsa Raj. And it would actually arguably be closer to what Ranjit Singh actually built himself, the Sikh Empire. That essentially was the Sikh Empire's model. And the UK, as I say, ironically reflects that same model, that separation between the symbolic monarchy, who can be of a faith, symbolically speaking, but a governing model, a governing structure, the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive, the three parts of a democracy, they can be completely secular. That's the difference. And that is what Khalistan can and will be, in my opinion. So, this whole discussion, thank you, Sikh Jedi, for that question, because it was a very pertinent, a very genuine question that required a genuine answer. But ultimately, as I said, there is no settled answer to this. These are my opinions, and I've done a bit of research and put it all together, hopefully to put a bit of a cohesive argument together that does answer your questions. And hopefully, I don't know if we can persuade you and others to become Khalistanis, but it does hopefully address the fears, the concerns about Khalistan. And ultimately, yeah, you've got to admit, there is no settled agreement. All this is to be agreed and negotiated, and there will come a time to do that. But ultimately, that is really what it's all about. It was a good question. I hope we've answered it to some degree. And I don't think anyone honestly can answer that question properly. And not because the question is unanswerable, but because actually the Khalistan movement itself hasn't done the work of answering that question. At least not in public. I suspect a lot of detail is being discussed behind the scenes. So, as I said, that's not a criticism of the Khalistan movement. But it is, I suppose, an invitation to anybody. If the modern Khalistan movement wants to be judged as meritocratic rather than majoritarian, the way to prove it isn't, it's not just throwing labels around or whatever. It's just it's getting together and working out the details so that answers the criticisms, so that people can genuinely stand up and say, yeah, okay, that answers the questions. It is hopefully reflective of the Sikh Empire. It is a genuine egalitarian nation run on democratic principles, but also following the Sikh faith as appropriate. So anyway, let me know your thoughts on that. That was a long segment, but I say it was two very big questions that actually did generate quite an important discussion that we do need to address on this show. So that's it. There are only a few comments, actually, after one of the shows last week, so I'll quickly zip through these. Stay safe. Global News has released a new short report on the channel on Maninder Singh. Maninder Singh, that Khalistani activist in Canada, yes, indeed, he was issued a duty to warn. It's shocking. It's disgusting that in a modern democracy, that a leader of that democracy can shake hands with the leader of another supposed democracy that is threatening to murder one of the other's citizens. Thus is modern politics. Suftu Muffins, the Castle of Brahmins is going to be grounded soon. I think the cracks are appearing, Suftu Muffins. I think their citadel is dissolving. It was built on sand and the sand is shifting. So it won't be long. And as you rightly say, please do subscribe and share. I'm going to pop that up, actually. Tell more people. We need more viewers of this show, particularly when we go live. We go live at 5, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And this is obviously at Thursdays, which isn't a live show. But we need more people watching in live, but we also need more people to watch the show and support the show. We need to get the truth out there. So please do. Gamon Grail with his daily Satsri account. And the same back to you, Gamon Grail. Thank you, G. And Suftu Muffins actually gets the final sign-off with a whole row of ice cream cones, exploding ice cream cones, ultimately. Well, we always do like to finish the show on a Khalistan Zindabad, so I'm going to say that myself, Khalistan Zindabad. Thank you guys, for all your comments. Thanks for all your contributions. Do keep them coming. Let me know your thoughts, and do leave a comment below, even however short. It's always much appreciated. Please email me if you think of anything that I need to know about. If you see an article or a news rumour or whatever, something you see on social media, just send me a copy and paste or a link or whatever, just so I get to know what's going on out there. I need you guys to feed me the information so I can check it, research it, corroborate it, find out if there's a genuine true story behind many of these rumours. So that's what I'm here for. But thank you very much indeed for watching. Tomorrow I will be uploading my interesting podcast with Dr. Gray. I'll keep an eye out for that. We discuss a few interesting things. We talk about Perry Anderson, an American or British academic who analyses India in a very concerning way, actually. And spoiler alert, he concludes pretty much what we conclude. But it's a discussion about that. But it's also a fascinating discussion about a proposed new structure for a federation of India, really aimed at the CJP protesters, saying, guys, this is the sort of thing you should be aiming for as a goal. In other words, broaden your horizons. Anyway, but watch that podcast. It'll be uploaded tomorrow. That's it for another day. Several minutes overdue, but I like talking to you guys, so I think we can indulge a few extra minutes if we can. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great weekend, you guys. Watch the podcast tomorrow, and all being well, I will see you Monday live at 5 UK time. Have a great weekend. Catch you guys later.